Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. E.
I am Bolton Mortimer, the Authenticator. We have the Duality abandoned. We are also late as fuck because we haven't been able to stream for like 2 weeks.
Yeah, the first time my family came into town without forewarning, and then the week after that, we just ended up missing each other.
Yeah, I think there was some kind of shenanigans going on with one or both of our internet connections, and because I kept trying to join into the call and there was nobody here, and then E comes back and is like, I tried getting you like 3 times and you weren't there, and I'm like, well, fuck me, this is just not working. But yeah, we are back, and we are also a couple weeks behind as a result of um not being on time. So don't worry. We have some more thematically appropriate for October slash spooky season topics coming down the pipeline. It's just gonna take a minute.
Yeah. So today we're discussing academia, the once ivory tower in the lauded halls that some of our greatest thinkers and people of interest used to hail from, now an absolute sewer pit.
It used to be a place where people of competence and substance used to do competent substantive things, but now there is a abstract moral ideology that suggests that competence and meritocracy are harmful delusions and normative statements that need to be abolished, don't you know? Because
Yeah.
morality.
And just also arrogance, extreme amounts of arrogance from people who think that just because they're in these positions, they're the equals or better of or of the men and women who came before who had, brilliant ideas and who
Yeah,
made our
no,
society a genuinely better place.
it's also tied in with the dilapidation of the academy began and begins and ends with something that we've known about for thousands of years, which is what's known as an appeal to authority fallacy. And one of the most interesting facets of the appeal to authority fallacy in recent years is that they've gotten so prone to making appeals to authority, they've actually modified the appeal to authority fallacy so that it doesn't catch them. Basically, they got so used to appealing to authority and so sure that they're in the right for doing so that in order to basically make their cognitive dissonance less painful for themselves, they modified the text of the appeal to authority fallacy to the appeal to unqualified authority. And here's why it is still a goddamn fallacy for anyone that needs it padded out for them. Qualification and authority are functionally the same thing because authority itself is supposed to be a byproduct of substantive rational action, i.e., you don't start with authority and get to substance. You start with substance, and a byproduct of that substance is supposed to be authority. It's like a shadow being cast by an object, and so on.
Yes, you
So to
prove
so
that
to
you
so
can
to
you prove
sorry,
that you can do the thing that you are able to accomplish things in a particular field, and because you have repeatedly shown your competence, you are granted authority in that particular field.
yeah, but the insidious thing of the modification of appeal to authority to appeal to unqualified authority is qualification and authority are the same thing. Therefore, in order to differentiate between a qualified authority and unqualified authority, what do you have to do? You have to appeal to authority. It becomes circular. We say we are valid because we say we are valid, and those people are unvalid and unqualified because we claim authoritative value over that, and therefore,
I think that
hence
this
the part of my brain that goes, "You completely have forgotten how this works, don't you?" Because logical fallacies aren't these edicts from on high. There are functional reasons why these fallacies are are avoided and why they're sort of canonized as logical absolutes.
I think this problem really is exacerbated in the social sciences, um, I think it gets really bad. What you mentioned, the appeal to unqualified authority, especially since a lot of these people are able to come up with these grand ideas and thoughts, but they don't actually have to try to apply these thoughts to the real world. They just have to make them appeal to their peers, so they get published in various journals, and it seems like this person has come up with some brilliant paradigm shifting idea, but when in reality, if you actually tried to do this, it would just end in disaster. But it never actually gets challenged on because it never has to actually be applied to the real world.
And here's another insidious part of this. And I agree with you, of course. I think it's not solely limited to just the social sciences, because my word, is there a history of the hard sciences doing this as well? And we'll get into that a little bit throughout the course of this, I'm sure, as well. But it's not just um that the rather insidious part of this is, and I completely forgot what I was going to say. Pitch that to me again, and I'm sure it'll come back to me. God damn it!
Yeah, about how their ideas don't actually have to be put into practice to test if they work. They just have to sound good to their peers in order to get published and
Oh, okay.
accepted by the.
Now I remember. Now I remember what I was going to say. There's an insidious aspect to this that doesn't often get called out anymore, because in order to call it out, you have to basically be a philosophical spurg, um, and philosophical spurgs are becoming rarer and rarer as time goes on. But fortunately for those of us on the internet, or perhaps unfortunately, because then I have to be annoying, I am a philosophical spurg, so I can explain this. There's this thing in philosophy known as a syllogism, which is where take a part, you take true information and you combine it with false information by way of warped logic, or you filter that true information through a faulty philosophical framework. Because the issue, and this is something that I run into with that one acquaintance of mine on Facebook that I've mentioned here before a couple of times. He does this thing, and he does this thing, and it's a very common thing among academics as well, where he thinks that if he provides enough data to support his claim, then his claim is unassailable. When in actuality, the flaws in his claim had nothing to do with the data that he was plugging into that equation. It had to do with the logical suppositions of the equation itself, i.e., the framework or the worldview that that information is being processed within, hence the syllogism. You take true information, true valid information, and you presuppose that it fits in a faulty logical framework, or you conflate true information and false information to the point that they become inseparable in your mind. And then whenever anyone tries to separate those two things, the true information and the false information, and say that this false information does not follow from this true information you cited, or you're processing this information through a faulty framework, then you accuse them of something like gaslighting. Because I shouldn't have to parse this thing because my framework is obviously the correct framework and all other frameworks are invalid, derp. Never mind that's a presupposition that implies that you are already authoritative, when the question of whether or not you're authoritative is the fucking point of the discussion. Again, difference between using appeal to authority in an unvarnished way and modifying it, because my appeals to authority are different because I presuppose they're qualitative, derp.
Yeah, one of the things when I was in college, when I would get into arguments with people, is that they would give, like you said, they would give a whole bunch of data, but they would always reach the wrong conclusions from that data. Instead of extrapolating a conclusion from the data itself, they would always have a conclusion and then find the data that proves that presupposed conclusion. And it's always really difficult arguing with these people because since they already have the conclusion, like they don't want to be broken out of that mindset.
Yeah,
It's
no,
very difficult.
it's here is my data, here is my argument. Then you come in and say, well, your data is fine, but your logic is wrong. And they say, don't dispute my data, data spam. And around it goes. And it's the most infuriating thing ever because no matter how precisely you explain to them, I am not disputing your data, I am disputing the presuppositions and frameworks that you are deriving from that data and or applying to it.
Not only
I.e.,
that, but
the
if you
thing
have
the thing you're seeing through your lens is not wrong, but your lens is distorting it.
things, the data might be correct, but the thing is, say you have data, but you don't really have enough to reach the conclusion that you're proposing. If you have like more, like an additional set of data, you would have basically like a bigger pool in which to be able to reach your conclusion. But they don't really care about that. They just need the data that supports the conclusion.
And again, here is where it gets even more complicated because if you go full Aiden, Paladin, or Teal there on their asses and actually examine the mechanism by which they arrived at the data and find that to be flawed, and you try to explain to them, you have this data, but you got this data through erroneous means because, for example, your sample size isn't right, or the survey with which you got this data was skewed in some way, or the way that data is being presented or processed is an error in some way. If you go full Aiden, Paladin, or Shield here, then they go, "How dare you dispute my data?" And it's like, but if the data is acquired in a faulty way or presented in a faulty way, then basing suppositions on it would by definition be wrong. Hello? Is this thing on?
Yeah. And maybe you oversampled from a particular group, or maybe the methodology by which you acquired that data, if you were doing an experiment, was possibly faulty. Like there are
And it
various
doesn't
ways
matter
that
how
data could
much
be
in
messed up.
great detail you can explain this to them, they will find some way of presupposing that you're wrong. Or if you if you accept their data but provide counter data, i.e., if you can find another resource or another source to cite that counters theirs, the other interesting thing I've noticed, both in laymen who think they're smarter than everyone and in certain academics, is they will presuppose that your data is invalid, so they don't even have to look at or engage with it.
Yes,
Never
because
mind that if you did that to them,
obviously,
they would burst a fucking blood vessel or something.
yeah, obviously, because they are so damn galaxy brain, their conclusion is quite obviously correct. And if you have a different conclusion, then obviously you must have erred in some way.
Or even different data. Like I've literally run into this before where after the third or fourth round of data spamming and me trying to go, this isn't a data problem, it's a logic problem, I will finally I will finally just be like, okay, you clearly want to have a data-based argument, so let's go ahead and have a data-based argument. Cites clip, or cites other study, or cites video footage countering the example you gave. I'm not going to look at X data from that source because that source is obviously skewed in some way. Don't you think perhaps your data is skewed in some way? Given that I can cite several examples of it being skewed in that exact way that I propose that it's skewed? No, my data is unassailable because appeal to authority. Your data is from an independent source that actually, doesn't filter and edit things, and therefore isn't properly academic enough, and therefore, yeah, but it's actual physical evidence of the thing you're talking about. It doesn't matter because that evidence could clearly be skewed in some way. Well, your evidence is also skewed, and around it goes. It's ridiculous. I really need to stop engaging with this person, but I swear to God, I keep them on my Facebook just to occasionally argue with them because it keeps my reasoning skills sharp. But he's not alone. I use him as a measuring stick because his mindset is so fucking common, especially among what I would go so far as to call miseducated people, i.e., people who've become so educated in a single framework that they cannot see any other frameworks. No matter, and what's really funny to me is in the social sciences, in things like that, you have this idea of things like moral and cultural relativism, or even, perhaps less controversial than that, anthropological objectivity, i.e., we can't presuppose that this belief serves a utilitarian function. We have to take their framework as writ, as given. I.e., when you go to study a shaman in a tribal culture, you can't go, well, what utilitarian function does this serve? You have to at least operate within um, their framework for the purpose of the thought experiment. And they'll do this with other cultures, with historical cultures, with religious fundamentalists of every different description, but they won't do it for people within their own culture who happen to operate on a different framework. They can do it for extremist Muslims, they can do it for people in the Middle Ages, they can do it for tribal cultures. They can't do it with their next door neighbors if their next door neighbors simply operate on a different worldview. And it's funny to me because their entire academic discipline is all about anthropological objectivity. Operate within the framework that you're actually studying. But when it's people in their own lives they actually have access to, for which that would be a very useful skill, they become worldview blind. And no matter how much you explain to them that they're becoming worldview blind, they default back to appeals to authority, basically. That is an
Well,
invalid person, therefore.
my theory behind why that is that, well, if it's a different culture, they have a different history, different language, different belief systems, uh, different genealogy. But when it's next door, they are you. Like they are the same people as you. Like same culture, music, history, heritage, and usually, I think it's because they don't want to even entertain the idea that their worldview might be incorrect and their opponent's worldview might be more correct.
Yeah, or at least that they're equally applicable. Because I genuinely don't like getting into the my worldview is better than your worldview thing. I don't find that to be useful, and it's intellectually dishonest even when it is useful. So my default assumption is, how are these equivalent worldviews? I don't need to get into the mine is better than yours game. That's what argument is for. But how could how could we find a principle or a standard that universally applies to all different worldviews? But as we and the anti-feminists and other, you know, anti-social justice types have discovered, diversity, equity, and inclusion means diversity, equity, and inclusion for all factors and all identities and all demographics, except, of course, for different worldviews. They want a world where it's a rainbow of different cultures, um, ethnicities, sexualities, demographics, and etc., but where everyone is subservient to the same worldview somehow. And they think that is diversity. And what's more, for as much as these people hate um, the white man's burden or the noble savage mythology, and that's fair, those two things are shit, they kind of engage in a new version of them just on the other end. Instead of we need to um, indoctrinate everyone into our culture because our culture is better, it's we need to indoctrinate everyone into our culture because our culture has sinned and we need another chance to make it better.
Yeah, it's just these people are really insidious, especially when it comes to talking about academia, well, a big part of academia is teaching. When these people become educators and are, engaging with students, you come to them to learn, they aren't really teaching them. It's far closer to indoctrination, because a teacher would engage with their students' questions in a genuine manner. They would exchange ideas, examine topics, and maybe even seriously consider a thing that the student would have to say if he proposed something
How to think,
in a
not
new
what
light
to
that they
think.
hadn't considered. But nowadays, you know, they always shut down discussion as if they are always have the correct
Yeah,
endpoint on every subject matter.
it's the difference between propaganda or proselytizing and philosophy. In philosophy, we don't have the answers, so let's examine all the possible vectors. In in propaganda and proselytizing, we have the one and only correct answer, and therefore everything else is inadmissible slash should be made subservient in some way to our one and only correct answer that we've had. One of them is a discussion, the other one is a news bulletin, it's a for your information. And I want to get into kind of the history of this divide, because it's not all that new, and yet it also has kind of a long pedigree, because it wasn't so very long ago that everything in academia was substance and merit and um, make an argument or show your work. Everything was that at one point. But towards the end of the towards the end of I'll push it back to like the 18th century into the 19th century and then throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. There became this standard whereby um to claim that you can judge something based on objective measures, be they logical or empirical, is false, and therefore there is no intrinsic value to anything ever. And a large part of this was actually due to the First World War, funnily enough. Um, After the fallout of the First World War, a lot of academics became, for lack of a better word, shell shocked. And they basically came under the nihilistic presumption that no culture that could have given rise to something like the First World War could possibly have any intrinsic value, and therefore let us contrive a bunch of ideologies or overlapping worldviews that hold everything to be sort of nihilistically empty unless there's human interaction with it. You had the you had the postmodernists, which took over from Hegel and Marx and Engels. Again, I still maintain that Hegel is the origin of all evil in terms of um, latter century philosophy, to a quite ludicrous degree, but that's neither here nor there. You had um, post-structuralists who would take the same principles of the Hegelian dialectic or postmodernism and apply them to science. You even had, and I recently was reminded of this because I've been watching a bunch of old videos and someone brought this up in one of those old videos. You even had this thing called the neo-historicists, which started a vector of literary criticism, um, whereby you cannot appeal to anything objective or anything verifiable within a work to determine the value of the work. You have to look at it in its cultural and historical context, and art is only valuable as a means to an end. Again, it's variations on the same framework that I think ultimately has its roots in a combination of Rousseau's social contract theory and Hegel's dialectical view of history and culture. And when that became the intellectual standard, it came with things like nihilism being seen as the intellectually honest position, um, which is another thing you see in modern culture that has its roots in academia, whereby if you hold to any ideals at all, you are considered naive, and only cynical nihilists, to some degree or other, be they absurdists, be they cynics, be they nihilists, be they whatever, be they realists, which is often just a softcore variant of nihilism and or absurdism for the most part. Um, that is considered the default intellectual position, and any adherence to the idea that the value of things is contained within the things themselves and can be held to logical standards, logical or empirical standards, um, is considered naive, childish, and even brainwashed.
Yeah. I mean, when you consider uh, how long uh, academia has just been descending into the you know mire of relativism and what's the word I'm looking for? I think cheapening is what I'm looking for.
Um, Undermining, maybe, might fit
Yeah,
better.
undermining. And we get these you know academics and professors who will literally accept basically anything so long as it supports the conclusion that they themselves has reached. I'm sure you remember the feminist paper that replaced certain words in Mein Kampf with feminist talking points and then was
Yes.
submitted for publication.
Thank the gods for that master troll. There was a guy, for those that don't know, who took sections of Mein Kampf deliberately and replaced Jew and Aryan with
Man and
with
woman.
patriarchy or with patriarchy or uh feminism or womanhood. Basically, take the buzzwords of the Nazis, swap them out with no editing for the buzzwords of your average critical theorist, and away they go. And like 3 or 4 different times in a row, these segments were um, added to academic journals
peer peer reviewed academic journals. Somebody had to read this and
and
decide,
thought it was
okay,
okay.
let's publish it.
Yeah, and thought it not only is it okay, but it's an insightful contribution to the discussion because it doesn't get added to such things if it's not deemed a insightful um, addition to the discussion. And it only was stopped because he got caught. If he hadn't got caught, he could have kept going.
I mean, I think that pretty much sums up everything you need to know. I mean, feminazi jokes aside, um, it's a big problem when academia cannot even critically examine a paper to find out that it's it's literally Hitler.
And
But
and yeah, and while we're on this, I'm gonna throw in yet another logical fallacy that I see committed by those with those who are allegedly our intellectual betters all the fucking time, which is the special pleading fallacy, i.e., we can't have a universalizable principle because if you change um, Aryan and Jew to pa- to womanhood and patriarchy, it it would be considered a false equivalency to actually draw any logical parallels between them, even if the actual logical framework they exist within is the exact same, and the only difference is the terminology and the concept attached to the terminology. I'm of the opinion that if you can't apply the standards you apply to your enemies to yourself, that standard un is inadmissible to the discussion. But apparently, in today's day and age, you'll get people who will say things like, "It's okay to use violence, dot dot dot, as long as you're doing it under the right circumstances," and for violence, read just about anything. The things that we get mad at our enemies for doing aren't what our enemies do, so long as we reframe them and give them a new terminology. It's not it's not a violent uprising. It's a righteous protest of the bourgeoisie or of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. It's not an insurrection. It's a righteous revolution. It's not it's not a demon. It's a god.
Yeah,
The old adage of my harsh judgmental god, your savage tribal demon. It's the same thing as it ever has
or like
been.
the saying of one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Yeah.
But another thing I want to mention is that, look, you got to think, if they even just checked for plagiarism, they would have realized that this was an excerpt from Mein Kampf. So they didn't even check to think that the work was plagiarized. They just read it, liked it, and published it.
The reason the reason for that, and this is something that's going to get me in trouble, but it is nevertheless true. That often happens where I say things that are likely to get me in trouble, but are nevertheless true, and people can't seem to find a way to argue it. But the thing is, this is not something people want to hear, but the reason why it appeals to them so much is because Hitler operated very much within the same framework, a framework that was very heavily derived from Hegel, because Hegel proposed his theory of cultural and historical dialectics, which featured a dichotomy between thesis and antithesis. Then Marx and Engels took that and hyper-focused on the economy or economics, and then you get the thesis being the bourgeoisie and the antithesis being the proletariat, and away we go. And then, of course, Hitler takes that and swaps bourgeoisie and proletariat for the Jewish conspiracy, quote unquote, which you basically could rephrase in modern parlance as the Jew triarchy if you felt like it. That's why I find it so funny when feminists will harp on about the intersectional patriarchy and then have such a bug up their ass about the idea of anyone else's particular conspiracy theory. Like they'll laugh at the satanic conspiracy theory of like extremely evangelical tradcons, or they'll laugh at the Jewish conspiracy theory um of Nazis, but they'll have no problem swapping Jew and Jew and Aryan for man and woman as and when it's convenient. But yeah, it's very much the same framework. It's just playing the game of special pleading, or even more colloquially, I like to call it swap out the MacGuffin, because that's all it effectively does is swap out the term, swap out the concepts, but leave the logical framework completely unchanged for all intents and purposes. And all of a sudden it's a new thing. For the record, by the way, I don't believe in any of these conspiracy theories. I don't believe in the satanic conspiracy theory of the Tradcons. I don't believe in the Jewish conspiracy theory the Nazis, and I don't believe in the patriarchy either, because conspiracy theories are, by their very nature, um, an extraordinary claim. And to quote Hitchens, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and also logic. that's my addition to Hitchens' way of doing things that I think he missed out on. He was always focused on evidence, but the thing is, as we just went over, you can take valid evidence and filter it through a faulty logical framework. And then when someone questions your faulty logical framework, you default back to the authority of the evidence where it's convenient. So I would argue that not only can a claim that is asserted without evidence be dismissed without evidence, but a claim asserted without logic can be dismissed with logic, would be how I would phrase that. Anyway, go ahead.
I think
Sorry.
one of the things that they're doing in order to support their terrible reasonings and faulty logic is altering definitions of words in order to specifically suit their requirements for their worldview. Like you have like quote unquote academics who were writing about you know race relations in the United States, the CRT, and they were trying to alter the definition of racism to make it seem like uh, the things they were doing weren't racist because racism can only be under certain conditions. Where under the actual definition of racism, the things that they say are incredibly freaking racist.
Yeah, it goes deeper than that and into other places than that. For example, to give kind of a non-partisan or a non-politically charged example, um, there is a guy by the name of Sam Bachman. He's a psychologist. Um, and his expertise is in narcissistic personality disorder and other cluster B personality disorders. And I don't dispute at all his academic erudition. His academic erudition is fine. However, in his pursuit to stamp out the evils of narcissism, he often seems to conflate any ambition at all with narcissism, or any sense of grandiosity or self-worth with narcissism, to the point that he has before in videos that I've seen, and he regularly posts videos on YouTube, but he's regularly before suggested that the only way to combat pathological narcissism is to return to the feudal system, because people in feudal societies had no sense of grandeur and no sense of ambition, and that's the only way to combat the negative aspects of grandeur or ambition. And that's the point where I go, okay, you've taken this research which you are an expert in, and you have followed it down a rabbit hole that does not logically follow from your premises here. But if you try to dispute that, he will of course call you grandiose and assume that you yourself are in some way narcissistic. For example, he made a video about the manosphere, did not mention men's rights advocates at all. And I made a comment wherein I mentioned to him it's somewhat disingenuous to talk about the manosphere as it relates to narcissism and not bring up men's rights advocacy at all. And he basically responded to me, this is a while ago, so I'm paraphrasing, but he responded to me with the claim of the men's rights movement has absolutely nothing to do with the manosphere, to which I responded, it's kind of the core of it, so no. And he responded to that with one of his favorite phrases, which is both counterfactual and grandiose. And I'm like, okay, but you didn't. I wanted to respond with, you didn't cite any sources for your claims, and you are going off of research done by people who don't have direct exposure to the manosphere or to men's rights issues, but just view them in the same manner that Jane Goodall viewed the apes. Um, I didn't though, because honestly, watching Sam Bachman too much makes me often worry that I have narcissistic personality disorder. Partially because I maintain he conflates any ambition or sense of personal grandeur at all with narcissism. To the point that it almost feels like any self-respect at all or any personal boundaries at all that aren't normative are narcissistic. But so yeah, I don't like arguing with him because I always worry this is exactly what a narcissist would say. So I dropped it. But I wanted to say you do realize that your sources for this claim come from people who themselves don't engage with the issues in question, right? But anyway, that's it. That's another topic for another day. But that's a non-partisan example of someone who even is more hard sciencey doing exactly that of taking valid data and extrapolating it to a disingenuous place.
One thing that I've noticed recently within academia is the constant taking of something that is simple and obvious and intellectualizing it to make it not appear to be obvious and making it appear more complex when it's actually very simple. Like I have a quote from an academic Thomas Sowell. The very commonness of common sense makes it unlikely to have any appeal to the anointed. How can they be wiser and nobler than everyone else while agreeing with everyone else?
Because um, evolution and evolutionary psychology exist, therefore, common sense at least has a circumstantial validity to it. The,
Yes, I
the
agree that there are things that are common sense, but it has been a practice in academia as of late to try and make what is simple complicated.
well, it okay. I'll defend this to some degree because I do think that it's worthwhile to verify what would otherwise be common sense or folk wisdom with an actual rationale. For example, there are primatologists who excel in the field of evolutionary psychology, even when they don't try to, um, who can see the roots of human morality in primates and can understand through examining the primates the evolutionary and like the actual functional purpose behind human beings' sense of empathy, for example. And I think there is some validity to that, i.e., it's all well and good for this to be an understood thing, but many things in the past have been an understood thing erroneously. So it's always good to verify through actual data and actual reasoning why these things are things. But I think what you're referring to is when they presume that the very obvious straightforward rationales aren't the case and usually also conflate it with some other framework they already exist in, i.e., it can't be that um it can't be that um human empathy is universal because we can verify it in every freaking mammalian species after a certain level of cognition. It has to be cultural because arbitrary differences between them, or something along those lines. And let's not forget the approved framework, which usually has its roots in critical theory, Hegelian dialectics, and intersectional feminism, whereby they will take an obvious thing, like the fact that um, certain body types are attractive to men for evolutionary reasons, and go so far as to call men bigoted for applying meritocratic standards to their female partners. Never mind that no amount of that kind of shaming will ever stop women from applying meritocratic standards to their male partners. And in fact, if a man doesn't jump through the meritocratic hoops, he's considered a failure, an incel, a beta male, etc.
Yeah, or going people saying that the very self-evident biological differences between men and women do not exist, and if they do exist, they're so insignificant as to not be relevant at all.
Yeah, the uh, a great example is the woman who was studying gender differences in the brain. And what the data suggested that she found was no one is 100% male brained or 100% female brained, but there are structures that exist predominantly in masculine brains or feminine. She essentially found that there are no male brains or female brains, strictly speaking, but there are various degrees of masculine brains and various degrees of feminine brains. But she presented her conclusion in journalistic interviews that gender doesn't exist in the brain, which is not which is not even remotely what that data can be suggested to mean. Because if there were no differences, then you would literally see none of those particular structures being different in various brains. But you
Yeah,
do.
my conclusion from that information that you provided would be that there are different types of male brains and different types of female brains. It's not like a hard set thing. And research recently that I've read suggests that brain structures are actually created due to a repeated pattern of behavior. So, like, if you're a man and you behave in ways that are typically more feminine, your brain structure will reflect that.
Yeah. And it's funny how everything under the sun is a spectrum, a spectrum, a spectrum, except for this. Because that actually does indicate to me there is a spectrum between male and female brains, and almost no one is on the extreme ends of either.
Yeah,
But
seeing that there are male and female brains really could just be boiled down to saying that there are different types of male and female personalities.
which is once more a no shit. Although I do think there again is some use in verifying that, because there are some people who are gender hardliners who actually do want the Pleasantville by gunpoint society, and I think those people should be told to fuck off as and when it's possible. Um, but at the same time, it's disingenuous to claim we found a spectrum of masculinity and femininity in various people's brains, therefore masculinity and femininity are meaningless concepts. That
You know,
doesn't follow at all.
as someone who is more traditionally masculine, I don't think that everybody should be, more like me because there are a lot of people who are different from me who have created a lot of great things that I enjoy. I mean, if everybody was more like B, we wouldn't have the music of Queen, and fuck that noise.
Yeah, no Queen, no Fleetwood Mac. Um, th- there
No Van
there is a
Halen.
there is a serious argument um for neurodivergent brains being what makes art possible, because the ratios involved there are just ridiculous. Like, I'm not saying therefore we should let artists be as degenerate as they could conceivably want to be, but I am saying that maybe artistry and degeneracy are linked necessarily in some way. Some degeneracy for artists is not only normal but should be encouraged, because otherwise no beauty or no value. And fuck that noise, as you say.
Yeah, but they seem to the same people who would be against um ironically hard lines in saying that like overly masculine men or overly feminine women also for some reason seem to suggest that like if you if a boy or a girl displays certain behavior, then maybe that also means that they are, of the
Gender
opposite.
non-conforming,
Yeah,
trans, non-binary, etc.
yeah, and it's just, maybe they're just not a typical sort of girl. I mean, they could still be a girl, like, but
Yeah,
they
they're
don't.
they're closer to the feminine spectrum. That doesn't make them gender dysphoric
Yeah,
in any way.
because I had a I don't want to put out his personal business, so I won't say his name, but I had a family member when we were kids was, you know, more interested in like girl like things. Like when he would come over to my house, he would play with my sister's dolls. Like by today's standards, he would be considered like non-binary or gender non-conforming. Like, but we didn't grow up with that sort of thing. So like he's a man, he's gay. He's not.
Yeah, somewhat embarrassing personal story on my part. The very first Halloween I can remember, I dressed as Snow White,
I
and
dressed as a Ninja Turtle.
I could easily see, especially given my shall we say Frasier-like tendencies, even from an early age, um, because I spent a lot of time I spent a lot of time with my mom growing up, like she one of the first adult shows I ever watched, we watched as a family, and it was Desperate Housewives. Or some days when I would be homesick, mom and I would both sit there for hours watching marathons of America's Next Top Model. And when my mom would decorate, or she would go clothes shopping, she would always take me along because she valued my opinion as to what looked good and what didn't. Because I had kind of an unironic queer eye, which all of this probably should have been an indicator for certain things that happened later, probably, but that's neither here nor there. My point is that if um, I was in the current generation, someone somewhere, especially given my other sort of neurodivergent, semi autistic tendencies, would have, and also my loner isolationist tendencies when I was younger, would have called transition. But yeah, no. Some some men are perfectly comfortable as men, hi, that don't need the masculinity and machismo. And that's the other thing. I grew up in a very, very traditionally masculine part of rural Pennsylvania. Everyone in my area hunts. A significant plurality of them are either farmers or truckers. Like we had days off on the first days of every hunting season from school just because the administration knew full well no one would no almost no one would show up that day. So I grew up in a very traditionally masculine um, way of doing things. I was just an extremely bookish, extremely eccentric, extremely posh, for lack of a better word, even though I grew up in like lower middle to like just middle class. Um, so yeah, no, some people are just feminine minded men or masculine minded women. And the same is true of tomboys. But this is actually an interesting point. Have you noticed this trend whereby when people transition, they don't just become a version of the other gender, they become almost a archetype of the other gender, i.e., I have seen many, 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 many more trans women wearing dresses than I've ever seen women wearing dresses. Because for most of my life, women wearing pants was just kind of normal. Like it
Yeah,
didn't
me too.
bother anyone. Whereas when you see people with and I'm not throwing shade. I have known many a trans person in my life. I've even known several non-binary people. I don't have an issue with this as a thing that exists, and I don't judge or begrudge anyone for being trans or being non-binary or being whatever. Um, but what I've noticed is the trans community tends to not only embrace their uh, dysphoria alleviating gender, I guess you could call it, but they embrace it more so than the cis people who are possessed of that same gender identity. I.e., you will
I
find
feel
more
like
trans women who are feminine than you will find average women who are feminine, and vice
I feel
versa
like it's a form
for
of
trans men.
overcompensation. Like they know that this isn't the sex they were born as, so they're trying to go as hard into it as they possibly can as a way of maybe showing to the world and possibly trying to convince themselves that this is uh, what they are.
I mean, that's one aspect of it, but I think even without beyond that rationale, there's simply a desire among trans people to embrace the most rigid, most stereotypical, or most archetypical, I guess would be the more charitable interpretation, version of masculinity or femininity. Which I find funny because if you listen to the trans activists, they're very often the abolished gender types. And yet their definitions of gender, as your example points out and my example kind of confirms, um, is so narrow and honestly kind of traditionalistic to the point where if a man likes playing with dolls or likes, watching interior design shows or modeling shows, he must be um actually a woman. Or if a girl exhibits tomboyish tendencies or even just masculine ways of thinking along the lines of an Alison Tiemann or a Karen Strawn, she must be male, and etc. Um, it's funny to me that for all of the abolished gender types, um, their definition of the genders they want to abolish are so narrow and traditionalistic that they've been abolished already. And they don't seem to understand that everyone is already far more liberated from these gender roles than they realize. And it's also funny because for all of this surface level abolish gender stuff, they only ever seem to want to abolish gender signifiers. They never actually try to abolish, and part of this is because they simply don't understand gendered dynamics, i.e., a male or a masculine presenting individual should still be obligated to define their value by what they do rather than who they are. And feminine presenting individuals should always be prioritized in terms of emotions and victimhood, even though that, in my opinion, is more core to the masculine role and the feminine role than any of the circumstantial gender signifiers.
I think it's partly because they don't actually understand
Yeah,
um, the opposing genders. Because here's the thing, and this has been like t- this is my opinion, also something that I've heard from multiple people who have transitioned. It's just they like what it's like to be the opposite gender is not something that you'll ever like really understand, even if you try to transition to that gender, because it's not simply as like being like presenting as a man to the world. It's like like the way society treats you, like when you're growing up as a boy,
it's a
the
framework thing. They
yeah,
don't under.
the expectations that are placed on you, like the way people react to you because you're a boy, the way you react to things, like
Well, and I think it also ties back to their worldview because they don't understand how gender dynamics actually work. They only understand how they think they do work or they think they should work in the abstract, i.e., Nora Vincent. We talked about her a couple of episodes ago. She was a at least feminist leaning lesbian, and she was told by her own words, she was told that, women are the empathetic gender, women are the emotional gender, women are the nurturing gender, and et cetera, et cetera. Men are primordial and toxic and cavemen and da, 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 and then she actually tried to go, to her credit, and verify some of these things, or at least to interrogate some of these things, and she found the opposite, not because she was an idiot or not because she was conned into believing in feminism or some shit, but because the feminist framework itself doesn't appear to actually understand how masculine brained individuals work, and vice versa. um and I would argue that feminism as an ideology doesn't also understand how women work, because their ideal of their ideal of feminism and even femininity and womanhood is honestly kind of default angelic, and their definition of what it is to be masculine is default demonic in some ways.
I think another thing is, I think we mentioned this a couple of episodes before. I forget which what, but like you mentioned the tearing down offenses that were placed there by people who came before you, if even though you don't remember why they did it. Like one example that I want to use is there have been studies showing that women are now miserable in dating post sexual revolution, because a lot of women still want marriage and kids and husbands, and they're told two things. One, that they can have it all, like career and family and motherhood, and
And
two
two,
is
that
that,
they should prioritize the traditional things because the traditional roles were somehow oppressing and enslaving them.
yeah, and that they
It's like,
don't.
don't choose your chains is the line I've heard often.
But also to have like the highest standards that they possibly can when choosing a mate, and I think also having an overinflated sense of their own value.
Yeah,
But the
and
thing
I'm not.
is,
Go ahead. I'm
now
sorry.
now because they are operating within this framework, a lot of women are miserable. Where in the old framework, and I'm not like a total like return to tradition type of guy, but if like in the old framework where marriage and dating and courtship was taken far more seriously, um, like you wouldn't have a bunch of women who were, saying like having sex, but then not having relationships and ending up alone.
Hmm. Um, I'm not sure to what extent culture is to blame for what you could call hypergamy. I think I think that feminism does for women what the internet does for everyone, in that it doesn't change human nature. It just makes it just makes any otherwise uh extant limitations almost non-existent, and makes it easier to show your true face, for lack of a better word. I think i think to some degree what kept women in line, and please be aware I am using that in the largest possible air quotes with the most possible sarcasm when I say that,
Come on, don't we know what you mean?
what was disappointment, um, was actually kind of an acceptance of bitterness, i.e., the instincts of women, and we can verify this through um, other cognates such as other primates. We can find this through evolutionary psychology, etc., etc. I think the default of women is that level of hypergamy, but before, because the world sucked for everyone, that impulse was beaten down and muzzled to enough of a degree that it was sane. And I also think that I'm not even sure I want to blame the sexual revolution, because, as I've often said on this show, I think the biggest problem with the sexual revolution is it's only half done. I.e., we gave women all the freedom in the world to be who they are, evolutionarily speaking, and we tightened the noose for men so much more just to compensate, instead of freeing both men and women and letting them find a new equilibrium, which I think is what we do need. We don't need, I don't think we need to return to the old equilibrium, but I think we need equilibrium. What we need to do is find a new paradigm, find a new status quo, a new equilibrium that we can actually operate within. But in between the old paradigm, which kept us in a kind of equilibrium that I will maintain sucked for everyone, and whatever the next paradigm is that will be more conducive, hopefully, to everyone. Now we're in this lopsided system where women are being told to go whole hog into their evolutionary defaults, and if men even attempt to apply their evolutionary defaults by being traditional providers or by being pickup artists or by being um, courtship oriented, they are beaten within an inch of their life, socially speaking, and might wind up homeless, and might wind up suicidal, and might wind up with all sorts of other mental issues,
Yeah,
and thus we have incel them.
but hypergamy has always been a part of female nature. I get that, but I think now it's gotten to a
It's
degree
so
that's no
conducive
longer
to it that
sane.
it's become.
It's
And
out of
again, the other issue is female hypergamy is allowed to run rampant, but male standards are called straight up immoral and or like maladaptive where possible.
yeah, like female hypergamy has reached a point where it is now a detriment to women because extremely rarely will they ever meet a man who will actually meet these standards to the point where they'll probably never meet him. And if they do, he's also the woman that everybody else wants. So
It
he has
it
no
really feel
incentive.
it really feels like the ideal utopia for modern women would be a tournament model, wherein there's one alpha male who is the most epic of all alpha males, and he just inseminates all the women.
Yeah, I'd fight in that tournament.
I mean, good. You'd be okay, but I don't think you would make it to the top of the. Uh, no offense, but
To be
uh,
fair, if such a tournament did exist, you better believe I would have been spent a lot more time training.
this is also true. I, of course, wouldn't bother because honestly, I'd be competing with the women to get the uber giga chat of this hypothetical.
Yeah, but let me ask you something. Do you think academia in its current state could be salvaged, or is it just going to continue down into a death spiral?
I think what we're experiencing in almost all vectors of society right now is a paradigm shift. You get a lot of doomsaying people saying, "Oh, we're 5 minutes away from societal collapse," or this or that. But the thing is, the same things happen towards the end of towards the end of or the beginnings of a societal collapse and in between paradigms. The difference is in the proportions. And I think if you look at the proportions of the issues we have in modern day society, they're closer to the kind you would see in a paradigm shift than you would in a societal collapse. If there was, if we were genuinely degenerate enough to be a collapsing society, I don't think anyone would notice because there would be no one left around to notice. We would have all degenerated into hedonistic lycention long ago. But there are still people who notice, which suggests to me that we're in the middle of a paradigm shift. So yes, I do think that academia can be salvaged, and the reason I think that is while the lion's share of academics are the Hegelian dialectic believing, critical theory believing types, there are still people who are not like that. There's your Jordan Petersons, there's as much as I crapped on him earlier, Sam Bakhnin. There are people
Wasn't
who still
wasn't
operate
Jordan
within the
Peterson
old
forced out of
model.
academia though?
Huh?
Wasn't Jordan Peterson basically forced out of academia though?
Yeah, but in the meantime, he's keeping the spark of the old academic standards alive. Um, Same thing in other fields with someone like with Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom wrote a book. Well, not recently. It was in like 1996, but he wrote a book called Shakespeare: The Invention of the Human, which was a overt refutation of the neo-historicists, because one of the first people the neo-historicists applied their new lens to was Shakespeare. Surprise, fucking surprise! And of course, there were people in academia who struck back against that. And I think there's enough people still in academia who do abide by things like merit, by determinism, by evolutionary psychology. You know, your GAD-SADs, your even somebody not necessarily in academia, but somebody like Aidan Paladin or Killdeer or the Prim Reaper, or there are still people who, for lack of a better word, have internalized everything that was good about the old paradigm and are still holding to it, while still being willing to experiment with other options rather than being hardcore traditionalists. I would throw academic agent in this category too, but I think academic agent has gone by Egon. He used to be sort of this arch ANCAP libertarian, and now he's slowly but surely becoming kind of an anarcho traditionalist, which is the weirdest fucking thing I've ever heard, but it exists apparently.
What are
Um,
your thoughts on the British thinker Douglas Murray?
um, that's the is he the gay one?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure I was thinking of the. That sounded really basic bitchy just then, but I just wanted to make sure I was thinking of the same person. Um, and that's always been something that is unique to me about Douglas Murray. Um, I like him. I don't agree with him on everything, but that's the other thing. I think there are people who abide by standards on different sides of the political. I don't think this is a there is only one correct answer and everyone just needs to get on board with the one correct answer solution. I think it's a difference in framework. In modern day academia, you have appeals to authority, you have moralism, you have the idea that meritocracy is harmful, you have cultural and moral relativism, you you have these notions of cultural objectivity that or anthropological objectivity that don't actually apply. Um, and in what you could call the outsider academia, you still have things like meritocracy, populism, libertarianism, and etc. And I think and I think there's enough room within those constraints, within the populist, meritocratic, libertarian constraints, that you'll have people who are on the left still. You'll have people who are on the right still. You'll have people who are on the center still. I don't think this is a partisan issue. I think it's a difference in worldviews, a difference in paradigms. Because, like I say, I think what the world needs now is not a collapse and a reformation, but a paradigm shift. The good news is, I think whether the powers that be want it to be the case or not, a paradigm shift is exactly what we're getting. Um, I could speculate on what I think a good end result of that paradigm shift would be, but I think that would defeat the point I just made, where it's not going to be any one person's ideological utopia. It's going to be a paradigm that has room for all the same people that are left, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about academia. Like the point wasn't to all agree with each other about everything. The point is that you would agree on some things, and then other things you would, have a debate on. And I think the problem is that a faction arose that where they did agree on so many things, and the things that people disagreed on, they basically just, excommunicated them.
Yeah, again,
And they have these
diversity of everything but worldview, basically.
they have these really bad ideas that we are seeing now put into practice that are evidently bad, but they're sticking to them and like basically cutting themselves off from any discussion that might suggest that hey, this isn't working.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there are idiots on our side too with regards to this, because no matter what worldview you operate within, there's going to be some people who take it to a stupid place. And I think that's one of the reasons why we got here. Because academia used to, um, maybe not as effectively as it should have, but it used to operate at least loosely within the parameters of something known as pluralism. The problem is that some people got so addicted to pluralism for its own sake that they basically conflated pluralism with what we would now call globalism or multiculturalism. And the thing is, pluralism was supposed to apply to things like worldviews, um, and to ways of thinking, and to um, different perspectives. Whereas the new multiculturalist slash globalist approach, you need to include everyone, but everyone also needs to be on some semblance of the same page, or else. And I think the mistake we made, and I think the mistake both sides of this make, because you have people who say we should get rid of any semblance of pluralism and return to the most traditionalistic way we can, and that would be fucked, because pluralism is fucking necessary and it works. Um, and
Yeah,
any civilization that doesn't abide by some version of pluralism always collapses. Uh, but there's the other side that conflates pluralism with multiculturalism and globalism to the point where if you complain about multiculturalism and globalism infecting pluralism, they'll actually accuse you of not being pluralistic enough. It's kind of like the issue of equality. Used to be equality opportunity, and then somebody took that and turned it into equality of outcome and then equity. These
yeah. The thing
these
is,
are,
regarding
yeah.
multiculturalism, like I've been against it basically since the concept was first explained to me because you need to have one overarching culture, especially in some place like the United States where it's so large and you have different states with different cultures and governments. And so you need to have one over overarching culture to bind them together. People could absolutely have their own like subcultures, whether that be interest or maybe things like
Well,
ethnicity,
that's
but
the thing. In
it
a
needs the
plur
overarching culture to make sure that as a country, people are can be united and not just constantly see somebody else from a different culture as the other. They have to be able to see them as my fellow American.
Yeah, and again, this is one of the fundamental differences between pluralism and multiculturalism. Before, you still had immigrants, and you still had cultures coexisting and adding to each other. Like, where would American cuisine be without the Germans and the Italians and the Chinese and the Japanese and yada yada yada? You know, the famous the famous Ellis Island argument. But at the same time, these people weren't supremacists or invaders. They weren't trying to convert everyone else to the glory of Italian Americanism or German Americanism. They were able to see that there was something worthwhile about America that they could add their own flavor to. And because meritocracy applies under pluralism, the things that worked better because of the other cultures' additions, like, American pizza, for example, become part of the overarching culture. And that's the difference also between pluralism and traditionalism, as it's currently being espoused, is under traditionalism, when a new culture rises to the top, it needs to be smacked down. Under pluralism, the overarching culture is dynamic and reactive enough to where if somebody wins the cultural rat race, they take it and they internalize it, and then boom, you have pizza parlors on every fucking corner, as well it should be, Hail America, etc. But under a really traditionalistic society, anything that was abnormal would be shunned because norms are the highest standard. Under pluralism, in many ways, combined with classical liberalism, meritocracy is the highest standard. Norms be damned where possible. And
Yeah,
that's a much better state of affairs than meritocracy is sinful, which is where we currently are.
yeah. Like recently, my father and I went to a Steeler game, and there were people there like from all over the place, people of different races, backgrounds, white, black, Asian, men, women, and we were just all there to support the team. And when they scored, we all cheered, and when they screwed up, we all like, oh, come on. But it's the thing that like this is all of our team. Like this is what unites us as people of this city, regardless of whatever subcultures we might be a part of.
And to be fair, it's not just limited to the city, I can tell you that much, because my father, for all of the problems I have with him, was a massive Steelers fan to the point where if somebody fumbled a touchdown while he was watching a Steelers game, he threw a fucking I've seen him do this several times. He throws a goddamn temper tantrum and throws his hat at the television screen. I've
Yep,
seen it
I've
happen
seen
like
my
five or
father do
six
similar
goddamn
things.
times.
But you have anything more to say about modern academia?
Um, no, other than I cannot wait for the paradigm shift to happen, and also because this is going to tie into where we end up in next week and the week after. Dear feminist academics, witch trials were not a woman's issue. End of discussion. Or rather, that is the lead in to the discussion that we will have both next week to some degree and the week after. Yeah, women are not the victims of every goddamn thing under the sun. Stop appropriating witchcraft culture, please.
Yeah, I also think that we are seeing a bit of a turn, like also in the way people view academia, because more people are starting to consider college to be less of a necessity, and they're saying, well, what I really want is just get a job where I can make decent money, so I'm going to like maybe go to a trade or something like that where I can just learn what I need to learn without having to go through all the
Yeah. And there again, college used to be the gold standard because college used to be worth it and based in merit and substance. Now it's not based in merit and substance anymore, so some people are getting in touch with their inner Socrates, as well they should.
All right, so that's going to be it for this week's Duality of Man. I've been Mr. E.
I've been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator. We have been the Duality of Man. Cheers, guys.
Bye, everybody.